What was done to the dead cavalrymen? The terrifying fate of Custer's army. You won't believe what was done to the bodies at Custer's last stand. The sickening things done to the dead at Little Bighorn. Custer's army's final nightmare. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory felt like the edge of the world. The sun beat down mercilessly on June 25th, turning the rolling hills along the Little Bighorn River into a shimmering haze. George Armstrong Custer rode at the head of the Seventh Cavalry, that familiar reckless fire in his eyes, his buckskin jacket open at the collar, hair cropped short now, but still carrying the legend of the long-haired boy general from the Civil War. He was chasing glory again, convinced this would be another quick victory, another feather in his cap. He had no idea that by the time the sun dipped low that afternoon, every man under his direct command would be dead, and what came after would haunt the American imagination for generations. The Lakota Sioux and northern Cheyenne had gathered in a massive village along the river they called the Greasy Grass. It wasn't just a camp. It was one of the largest assemblies of Plains people anyone had ever seen. More than 5,000 souls, maybe 6,000, with somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 fighting men. Women, children, elders, and families who had fled the reservations because the government had broken every promise, because gold had been found in the sacred Black Hills, land the treaties said would be theirs forever. Custer's scouts had warned him. The village was enormous. The warriors were ready. But Custer wasn't the kind of man who listened to warnings. He split his regiment into 3 battalions, the classic move on paper that so often failed in the dust and chaos of the real thing. Major Marcus Reno would hit the southern end. Captain Frederick Benteen would swing wide to cut off escape, and Custer himself would charge straight into the heart of it with 5 companies, about 210 men. Reno crossed the river first, bugles sounding, sabers drawn in the old style that already felt outdated against repeating rifles. For a few frantic minutes it looked like they might break through. Then the warriors poured out like hornets from a kicked nest, Sitting Bull's people, Crazy Horse's fighters, Gall's hunkpapas. Reno's line crumpled almost immediately. They retreated in panic to a bluff, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Benteen linked up with them later, and together they held off wave after wave for hours, fighting for their lives in a desperate defensive circle. But Custer never made it to the village. He led his men along the ridges, trying to find a crossing, trying to hit the camp from the north. The Indians met him with overwhelming force. What historians now call Custer's last stand lasted maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour at most. It wasn't some heroic hour-long Hollywood epic. It was quick, brutal, and total. The companies under Captain Miles Keogh and Lieutenant James Calhoun tried to form skirmish lines, but the warriors flanked them, using the terrain they knew so well. Men fell where they stood. Horses screamed. The final pocket on what we now call Last Stand Hill collapsed under sheer numbers. When the smoke cleared, 210 officers and troopers lay dead across those hillsides, Custer among them. His brothers Tom and Boston, his nephew Audie Reed, the regimental band leader, the newspaper correspondent, every single man who had ridden with him that morning. The battle ended, but the story was only beginning. Down in the village, the women and older men and children had listened to the gunfire all afternoon. They had walked hundreds of miles through winter snows to reach this place. They had buried their own dead from previous fights with the soldiers. Now their warriors had won something rare, a decisive victory against the Bluecoats who kept coming no matter what treaties were signed. The fighting men rode back triumphant, but it was the women who walked out onto the battlefield as the sun began to set. What they did there wasn't random fury. It was deliberate, it was ritual, and it was rooted in beliefs that went back centuries. In Lakota and Cheyenne tradition, death wasn't the end. The spirit carried forward into the next world in the condition of the body it left behind. A warrior who died whole could fight again in the afterlife. He could hunt. He could protect his people. He could even return to haunt his enemies. So to make sure that didn't happen, you took measures. You cut off the hands so he couldn't grip a weapon. You severed the legs so he couldn't ride or run you down. You gouged out the eyes so he could never find his way back to your camp. You took the scalp as a trophy, yes, but also because the hair held power. You drove arrows into the body long after life had fled, pinning the spirit down. Some accounts say young boys shot at the corpses for practice. Others describe women using knives with precision that spoke of long practice. This wasn't blind savagery, though that's exactly how the Eastern newspapers would paint it within days. It was warfare the way the Plains people had always understood it, total, spiritual, as well as physical. And it carried the weight of memory. Many of the women on that field had lost husbands, brothers, children at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, when Colonel John Chivington's Colorado volunteers had slaughtered a peaceful Cheyenne village, mutilating bodies in ways that made even some white officers sick. They remember the Washita in 1868, where Custer himself had attacked Black Kettle's camp at dawn, killing women and children and then boasting about it. Revenge wasn't abstract. It had faces. It had names. It had years of broken promises behind it. Custer's own body lay near the top of the hill, surrounded by his men. When the soldiers finally reached the field 2 days later, they noted something strange. Unlike almost everyone else, Custer wasn't heavily mutilated. He had been stripped naked except for his socks. 2 bullet wounds, one through the left side of his chest, one just in front of his right temple. His face looked peaceful, almost surprised. Some said the Indians didn't recognize him because he had cut his famous golden curls short before the campaign and wasn't wearing his usual flashy uniform. Others whispered that the warriors had shown a strange respect for a worthy enemy. A few later accounts claimed women pushed sewing awls into his ears so he would hear better in the next world, or that an arrow had been driven into his genitals. But the men who saw him first, Dr. Henry Porter, Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, described him as relatively intact. "Clean as a baby's," Porter reportedly said. His brother Tom, though, that was different. Tom Custer had an eagle tattoo on his chest. That's how they identified what was left of him. His head was crushed flat. His heart had been cut out. His body was hacked almost beyond recognition. The man who had once captured the Confederate battle flags at Appomattox died in a way that made hardened veterans turn away. June 27th. General Alfred Terry's column finally linked up with the battered survivors of Reno and Benteen. They had been marching hard, expecting a coordinated victory. Instead, they found the battlefield. The first thing that hit them was the smell. 2 days in the June sun had done its work. Bodies swollen, blackened, crawling with maggots. The wind carried the stench for miles. Lieutenant James Bradley, one of the first scouts to reach the ridge, wrote later that it was like nothing he had ever encountered. The silence was worse. No birds, no insects humming in the grass, just the wind and the sound of boots crunching on dry earth. As the troops moved forward, the full horror unfolded. The bodies lay exactly where they had fallen, scattered over more than a mile of broken ground. Most were naked. Most had been scalped. Heads were bashed in with war clubs or stones, blunt trauma so severe that skulls were shattered like eggshells. Eyes were gone, sockets empty and staring, noses and ears sliced away, hands and feet missing. One soldier recalled seeing a man whose arms had been cut off at the elbows. Another described bodies with long slashes down the length of the torso, as if someone had tried to skin them. Genitals had been removed on many. Arrows protruded from chests, backs, thighs, sometimes dozens per body. Some men had clearly been alive when the worst began. The pattern of bullet wounds suggested torture before death. Captain Charles Rowe, moving among the dead, said the scene was ghastly and sickening beyond description. Lieutenant Godfrey, who had survived with Reno, walked the field later and wrote that it looked like white boulders from a distance. Up close, it was something else entirely. Here a hand gone, and here a foot or a head, he remembered one officer saying. Gashes cut in all parts of the body, eyes gouged out, noses and ears cut off, and skulls crushed in. Another trooper spoke of flesh, cut in long strips, like someone had taken a knife and peeled the men alive. The smell clung to their clothes for days. Some men never spoke of it again. Others woke up screaming for years. Identification was almost impossible for most. The heat and the mutilations had done their work. They went by clothing scraps, pocket watches, letters, tattoos, or the position of the body. Sergeant James Finley and Private John Finkel were found near each other on Calhoun Hill, still roughly in their skirmish line. The newspaper man, Mark Kellogg, lay among them, his pencil still clutched in a severed hand. Boston Custer was identified by his youth and build. The regimental surgeon, Dr. George Lord, was never found at all. His body may have been carried off or simply lost in the chaos. The burial detail had almost nothing to work with. 8 shovels for the whole command. The ground was hard and dry. They scraped shallow trenches with knives and hands, tossed dirt over the bodies where they lay. No coffins, no markers except a few sticks or stones. Custer received a slightly deeper grave near the top of the hill, covered with a travois and rocks. They worked quickly because the smell was unbearable and the threat of another attack hung in the air. Many of the dead were never properly buried at all. Coyotes and wolves scattered what little earth covered them within weeks. Rain washed bones down the ravines. For years. Afterward, visitors to the battlefield would find femurs poking from the grass, ribs bleaching in the sun. The news reached the east like a thunderclap. "Massacre!" the headline screamed. Custer was instantly a martyr. Paintings showed him standing tall amid falling men, blonde hair streaming, saber raised. Plays, poems, songs, all turned the disaster into legend. Custer's last stand became shorthand for heroic defeat. The mutilations were described in lurid detail, but always without context. No mention of Sand Creek, no mention of the treaties broken for gold. The public wanted savages to hate, and the newspapers gave them exactly that. Within months, the Army poured more troops into the plains. Crazy Horse surrendered the next year and was killed in custody. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, returned and died at Standing Rock in 1890, shot by Indian police during the Ghost Dance troubles. And then came Wounded Knee, where the Seventh Cavalry, reformed and still carrying the memory, opened fire on a band of Lakota, killing hundreds, including women and children. The circle had closed in blood, but the dead at Little Bighorn didn't rest easy even in the ground. In 1877, the Army returned to rebury what remained. Custer's bones, identified by a lock of hair his wife Libby later confirmed, were exhumed and sent east to West Point. The others were gathered into a mass grave on the hill, marked by a granite monument that still stands today. Yet even that wasn't the end. Erosion, animals, souvenir hunters, they all took their toll. In the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologists working the battlefield found scattered remains that told the same grim story. Blunt force trauma to skulls, cut marks on bones consistent with knives and hatchets, evidence of dismemberment. Modern science confirmed what the eyewitnesses had struggled to put into words. Today, the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument tells both sides of the story. There's a monument to the soldiers, yes, but in 1991, Congress changed the official name from Custer Battlefield and authorized an Indian memorial. Red granite markers now show where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fell. Oral histories from survivors like Wooden Leg and Kate Bighead have been recorded and preserved. We've begun to understand that what happened to those cavalrymen wasn't just the act of savages. It was the final, desperate chapter in a war where both sides had long since stopped seeing the other as fully human. The women who walked that field in 1876 believed they were protecting their children's future by making sure the soldiers' spirits could never return to hunt them again. The soldiers who buried their comrades believed they were honoring the dead of a noble cause. History is rarely clean. It's written in blood and dirt and silence, and yet, standing on that ridge today with the wind moving through the grass and the monuments casting long shadows, you can almost hear the echoes, the bugles, the rifle cracks, the cries, and then the terrible quiet that followed. 210 men rode up those hills on a bright June morning. None rode back down. Their bodies became the battlefield itself. Stripped, broken, returned to the earth they had come to claim. Their story didn't end with the last shot. It only changed form. It became legend. It became warning. It became a question we're still trying to answer more than a century and a half later. What was done to the dead cavalrymen wasn't just violence. It was a statement written on human flesh about power, about belief, about the cost of crossing a line that both sides had drawn in the dust. The terrifying fate of Custer's army wasn't dying on that hill. It was what came after. It was the knowledge that in war, sometimes even the dead don't get to rest. They become part of the story that keeps being told long after the last bone has been gathered and the last marker placed. And in the quiet of the greasy grass, the wind still carries their names.